Hello students, today we will talk about the Bhakti movement in South India. A unique devotionalism known as the Bhakti cult manifested itself around the 7th century in South India. This new religious consciousness spread northwards and swept over the Indian subcontinent. It reached its peak between the 14th and 17th centuries. This Bhakti spiritualism assumed a pattern of complete surrender to a chosen favorite among the Hindu pantheon of gods, along with intense adoration and passion in worship. Now, the idea of Bhakti had been embedded in ancient Indian texts, but acquired a new emotive intensity and vitality of form. It provided stimulus to a religious movement that removed the barriers that had till now restricted the ordinary masses from reaching out to the Almighty in their own fashion. The need for a priestly class was denied. Their strictures became untenable and unacceptable. Let us look at the legacy of the scriptures. The idea of Bhakti was found in the Upanishads. The Mundaka Upanishad, 800 to 300 BCE, indicated that man's ultimate salvation reposed in divine will. Only he who had been accepted by the Almighty could be at one with him. The Shetashvatara Upanishad first mentions the term Bhakti, while others indicate various aspects of devotion in the Bhakti style. Scholars, however, are reluctant to accept that this new religious consciousness came from the Vedas and Upanishads. They find that references to Bhakti were scattered here and very hesitant, and really not directed to a personal God that was so endemic to this new spiritualism. The inalienable and intimate relationship between man and God was not really highlighted here, according to them. It was after the emergence of Buddhism that a need arose to compile the multiple strands of devotionalism present in the Upanishads into a consistent textual format. This led to the creation of the Bhagavad Gita. It was in the discourse of the Bhagavad Gita that we find allusions of devotion directed at Krishna and a proper denoting of the Bhakti spirit. By the 4th century, Vedic religion was confronted by Buddhism, and this was later to provide the principal impulse in the attempts to strengthen Hinduism through Bhakti. So, Bhakti was in a sense an offshoot of Hindu revivalism. Scholars have identified Hindu revivalism in the north under the Gupta Empire as crucial to the rise of Bhakti as a singular religious force. The encounter with Buddhism and Jainism impelled Brahmins to engage in ideological debates with these creeds in order to eliminate non-Vedic philosophies and re-establish the domination of Hinduism. A direction towards Bhakti Marga, along with Gyan Marga and Karma Marga, as the possible means of salvation, was highlighted at this point by the Brahmin intellectuals. The path of Bhakti in its embryonic form was also embedded in the Mahabharata, of which, as we all know, the Bhagavad Gita was an integral part. So Bhakti saw a staggered rise. The development of the Bhakti cult was gradual and really cannot be pinned down to a particular century. In the southern parts of India, we see a swing towards a new form of bhakti which manifested itself through poetry steeped in mystic love and passionate devotion towards God. This emotional content peaked in the 5th century, with people in the south divided in their means of attaining salvation. Those who were prone to Aryavarta, or those who had been influenced by Aryavarta, venerated Vishnu, the manifestation of Surya or the sun, as their chosen deity. Those more inclined to Dravidian culture found solace in Shiva. Shiva was a very ancient god, volatile in nature, but who had a special place in the religious beliefs of the Dravidians from time immemorial. In the 7th century, we see prolific Tamil poetry by the Shaiva Narayanas and the Vaishnav Alvaras. And these epitomized the intense and ecstatic spirit of bhakti that was soon to burgeon into a pan-Indian sub-religion. Essentially, bhakti represented a new religious mood. The ultimate desire of humankind was to attain salvation by being at one with the Almighty. And this mystic realization could be achieved in two ways, either through prapatti or surrender, or through pure and selfless love towards a personal God. This personal God could be Vishnu, Rama, Shiva, or Krishna. He would be the locus of bhakti adoration. Prapatti implied the will to serve the Lord in a devoted and truly dedicated manner, almost like a servant, who then earned the status of a bhakta. Everyone, including the lowly and uninitiated, could traverse this path, as there was no need for any spiritual guidance from the texts or from a priestly class. The path of pure love, on the other hand, was conceptually a relationship of equality and was a means of deepening the attachment between man and God. The outward manifestations of these sentiments were manifold. Strikingly perceptible was the preaching of the Bhakti saints during this time. These Bhakti saints encouraged unfettered expressions of love for God through evocative poetry, intermittent pilgrimages, and gatherings where songs and chanting of the Lord's name in unison would lead one to experience the sublime. People of all creeds and classes had a total involvement in this process, which raised this movement to unprecedented levels. As the movement matured, the caste system had absolutely no place in the new scheme of things. Now, if we look at the first phase of bhakti, we will have to talk about the 5th century and the 7th century, right? The movement in South India had two strands, Shaivism and Vaishnavism, right? It was once more that we find here that the bhakti movement assumed a new momentum as a reaction to Buddhist and Jain religious practices which had proliferated here and which at the same time had become very complicated and anterior looking. Now, in the beginning, Brahmanism did not come under forceful attack. We must remember this, that in the first phase, absolutely first phase, Brahmanism did not really come under attack. by the Bhakti movement. So older scriptures, some form of ritualism, and even pilgrimages continued. In fact, the initial theoretical positions leading to new perceptions of bhakti were taken by the Brahmins themselves. Their purpose too was to weaken Jainism and Buddhism. Now, bhakti ideas were buoyed up by feudal monarchies like the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Cheras, and the Cholas, as they came under the influence of Brahmin-centered temple culture. So initially we find that the bhakti movement was really temple-centered. Now, Mahendravarman Pallava converted from Jainism to Hinduism, and this set in motion the royal patronage of the bhakti movement. The Pandya monarch Varaguna, the first of Madurai, and the Chera king Kulashekhara also encouraged the bhakti cult in their kingdoms. Now, Mahendravarma had actually destroyed the Jain monastery and replaced it by a Hindu temple. Mahendravarman initiated another trend in the Tamil country, that is encouraging bhakti in temples. So, originating in the east coast and then heading south and southwest, the bhakti movement in peninsular India flourished around famous temples such as Tirupati and Kanhi. Bhakti served as a link between the different temple centers through pilgrimages. In fact, we know that Tirupati was the seat of Tirumal or Vishnu. Kanhi was the later capital of the Pallava kingdom. Slightly later temples like Chidambaram, Tirunallur, Madurai, and Kumbakonam also became important centers of bhakti. If we talk about temple-centered bhakti, or bhakti as it was practiced in the temples, we find that here bhakti was nurtured by the Brahmin priests who were involved in the study of sacred literature. Texts like the Mahabharata were expounded and popularized among the masses. The projected Brahmin missionary propaganda encouraged spontaneous interaction between Brahmins and non-Brahmins, like non-Brahmins like hereditary temple retainers, tenants, guards, etc. Two antithetical reactions, however, emerged from this. One, there was an intensification of the process of Aryanization. A second factor was that there evolved an anti-Brahmin mindset. So, soon we find a subtle change. Local legends and myths were now superimposed on this Aryan Brahmin ideology, which now took on a new Tamil exposition. Local saints, who were often miracle workers, became the new focus of veneration, which rapidly popularized these bhakti ideas throughout the South. Many of these saints remained attached to temples. Gradually, the appeal of the two major religions, Jainism and Buddhism, faded. It was at this time that the Alvaras and Nayanars were able to step in with their simple philosophies, which they preached in Tamil, that is the language of the people. Thus, we can say that the popularity of the Shaivas and Vaishnavites increased exponentially in the South from the 7th century. Let us talk about two great philosophers, right? We will first take up Shankaracharya. Now, around the 8th century, Shankaracharya expounded his philosophy of Advaita or non-dualism and engaged in polemics with different strands of Hindu thought. He spoke of the inalienability of the Atma and Nirguna Brahma, which in Hindu philosophy was formless, beyond comprehension, yet all-pervading and universal. He wrote commentaries on the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita and explained that ignorance was the cause of the yawning void between man and God. And this, according to him, could be mitigated by knowledge or Gyan. So Shankaracharya placed a lot of importance on Gyan. Ramanuja, the second sage that we are talking about here, was from the 11th century. And Ramanuja stood apart from Shankaracharya with his idea of Vishishta Advaita, or qualified monism, or qualified non-dualism. Ramanuja preached that the human soul is not synonymous with the divine absolute, but was a part of it. Although being conditioned on the divine, the human soul had a separate identity and possessed reality. Now, in the intervening centuries, there had been a little slowing down of the bhakti movement because there had been an overemphasis on Brahmin-centered temple bhakti, which did not really challenge the caste system and also leaned towards ritualism and contributed to a decline in the essence of the bhakti spirit. On the other hand, Prapatti too had acquired an extreme form. Therefore, Ramanuja played a especially important role here because he laid emphasis on devising a middle path between the two divergent trends which I have just described and encouraged an inward look into bhakti. He stressed on the centrality of devotion, bhakti, as a significant means of attaining divine grace, superseding Shankaracharya's emphasis on knowledge or gyan. The movement now acquired a greater momentum, leading to the questioning of long-established religious and social categories. Look at bhakti in South India specifically. Now, in the 5th century, it was in the Dravidian South and the Tamil kingdom in particular that the inherent strains of the bhakti spirit in Hindu texts was rejuvenated. During this period of high bhakti zeal, from the 6th century, the lands of the South were suffused with Tamil Vaishnav and Shaiva literature. Poetry dedicated to Vishnu by the Alvaras abounded in the peak era of bhakti, as did devotionalism in songs in the name of Shiva, who, as I've already said, was the most venerated god in Dravid culture, and this was done by the Nayanars. In fact, Shiva had been lauded from time immemorial, and ancient Sangam texts often began with invocations to this particular god. Now, there were about 63 Nayanar literatures, all belonging to Cholamandalam, though a few were not poets. And there were others who did not fall into the Nayanar genre at all because they did not belong to the core area dominated by the Chola Empire. There were also some later poets. Now, Manikabha Chakkar was a very important poet of the post-Nayanar period, right? His greatest work was Tirubachakam, embodying Bhakti Rasa and Kavya Rasa. There was also a female lyricist, Punniboti, of the 6th century, who hailed from Karaikal. She was definitely one of the earliest women poets of great significance. She had been abandoned by her family, but had a rich repertoire of works replete with the pathos in her appeals to the Lord Shiva for salvation from her earthly trials. Now, to give a very scattered idea of Tamil literature, mention may be made of Tebaram and Tirumurai. Tebaram by Nambiyandar Nambi was a 10th century collection of Shaiva works where three major poets, Samandar, Appar and Sundarar feature. Tirumarai were devotional hymns, which was another brand of bhakti literature. So we have a number of balladists here like Charman Perumal, 8th century, Tirumular, 9th century, Patintup Pilloy, 10th century, Nambyandar Nambi, 11th century, and Chekkirar, 12th century. So these were very important balladists who adorned the list of Tamil devotional literature. Now, Vaishnav literature, so we have spoken of Shaiva literature. Let's talk about Vaishnav literature. Vaishnav literature was less voluminous than Shaiva literature. Why? Before I go into the reason behind this, I must say that it was considered to be not too antagonistic to Buddhist and Jain literary culture in the south. Now, why was it less prolific than Shaiva literature? This is because the potential of Vaishnav influence was restricted in comparison with the Shaivas who got the patronage of the Cholas, the Pandyas and the Pallava dynasties. Therefore, their religious maxims had been implanted among a wide range of people. So Shaivism was definitely more popular and more prolific, right? Now, we can talk about Nalair Divya Prabandham. What was this? This was a collection of Vaishnava padas or couplets. This was compiled by Nath Muni or Ranganath Muni in the 10th century. It contained the compositions of 12 Alvara poets, Kulashekhara and Namallovar being the foremost among them. These seem to be the principal compositions of the era. Now, Namallovar was held in extremely high regard by devotees. His works were treated with great reverence and they were called Bhaktamritam, Shamaveda or Dravida Upanishad. So these were the nomenclatures that were given to the works of Namallovar. So venerated was he. Now, Namallovar had a stature that was comparable to Manika Bhatchakar, right? Namallovar was upset with the fact, in fact, he rued the fact that there was a trend towards writing in praise of the monarch over the tendency of invoking the gods. So this trend had proliferated. This trend towards praising the monarchs more than praising the gods had proliferated. He therefore urged all poets to utilize their skills in the praise of personal gods. And he was convinced that it was Vishnu who was the ultimate recipient of all this adoration from humankind. Another very important poet of this time, another important female poet of this time was Andal, right? Andal was the daughter of the Alvara Periyaloar, and she was the composer of Tiruppabai, a paean to Lord Krishna in 30 lines. She also composed Nachiyar Tirumodi, where Sri Krishna was the hero and she herself was the heroine. She made her mark as an extremely significant Vaishnava balladist. So, overall, the hymns of the Alvaras and Nayanars attained immense popularity, they attained a scriptural quality that was recited in the temples and also personally by devotees. The focus on monotheism as well as egalitarianism made them a potent force of socio-religious transformation. Now let us look at Kannada literature. Shaivism possibly found a foothold during the Chola domination of parts of Karnataka as well as under Rajaraja Chola around 985. It was in the 12th century that Basava, a seer of the Virasaiva or Lingayat sect, initiated Hindu revivalism in the wider backdrop of long-term Jain cultural ethos. Basavan was an axial in the establishment of the Shivanubhav Mandap in Kalyan, where hundreds converged to hear Basavan, generating a flood of devotion towards Shaivism. Basavan, along with other literary luminaries of the time, collectively known as Shiva Trimurti, Pandit Tai, and Acharya Panchak, ensured widespread acceptance of the Shaiva cult in Karnataka. The other important literary figures at this point of time were Manchanna, Sripati Pandit, Mallikarjun Pandit Aradha, Renukacharya, Marul Siddha, Ekorami, etc. Now, Basavan and his contemporaries felt the need to spread the word of God in uncomplicated language and hence adopted simple prose, and which was compiled in short paragraphs. However, his words contained an inner rhythm which resonated with the people. Therefore, a new literary genre known as Vachana, or songs in prose, emerged in the Kannada language. It was through these vachanas that Basavan voiced his antipathy towards idolatry, towards the caste system, and the traditional scriptures, the Vedas and Brahmanas. There were hundreds of poets who later mirrored these thoughts. Bhogini Mahadevi enjoyed great eminence as a female Shaiva poet of the 12th century. Bhogini Mahadevi was actually a princess. She relinquished the life of a princess and, like Meera and Ondal, remained engrossed in an exquisite relationship with the Almighty. This passion and emotional longing to the detriment of physical desire was reflected in her charming poetry. The famous poet Harihar, known as Giriraj Kalyan, Ragbank, who belonged to the 12th century, Somraja, who belonged to the 13th century, Chamras and Sivajogi of the 15th century, which is slightly beyond our time of interest, were all devotees of Shiva. The Karnataka region had witnessed the spread of Jainism from very early times, and Jain literature dominated right till the 12th century under the patronage of the Chalukyas. And that is why Basavan's and all the other literatures' contribution is so significant. Towards the end of the 10th century, the sage Ramanuja arrived in Dorsamudra and influenced the Hoysala king Ballal Raja to accept Vaishnavism. Vaishnavism was popularized by the Daitabad of the doctrinaire Madhavacharya in the Karnataka region in the 13th century. Let us look at Telugu literature, and this is the last language that we will take up when in the context of South Indian Bhakti. Now, we find that in the Andhra region, there was an overlap with the neighboring Karnataka, where literature was concerned. Although the Kakatiya dynasty had ruled in Andhra in the 12th century and the Hoysalas had ruled in Karnataka, the Chalukyas had dominated over large parts of Andhra in the past. Therefore, there was a similarity of language and script between Kannada and Telugu. Telugu was the mother tongue of Pomp and Ponna, two Karnataki literatures of the Triratna group. Interaction between poets and lyricists of the two neighbors brought about a flowering of Shaiva literature in Andhra country. Here, in Andhra, Shaiva literature remained the main platform for the expression of bhakti from the 11th to the 15th century. Mallikarjun Pandit Aradhya, the famous Kannada poet and guru of the 12th century, was instrumental in the proliferation of the Shaiva cult in Andhra country. His followers were distinct from Bashavan's Virasaiva sect in many aspects, and hence they were known as Aradha Saivas. Now, Mallikarjun Pandit Aradhya was extremely forthcoming in his attitude and was intrepid enough to suggest that a woman was within her rights to deny marital bonds if her husband did not share her faith in Lord Shiva. Mallikarjun's principal disciple was Nanni Chod. He emerged as one of the foremost writers in Telugu country, in Andhra country. In Telugu, he wrote Kumar Sambhava. This Kumar Sambhava breached the classical structure of the Kavya that had been found in Nannayar's Telugu Mahabharata. The latter text was actually a work of an earlier century and had helped mitigate Jain influence in the region to some extent. In Telugu, it was the Mahabharata and the Bhagavat that gained more esteem as classical discourses, that is, more than the Ramayana. Mahabharata and the Bhagavat were more popular in Andhra country. In the 11th century, Nannaya translated the Mahabharata partially. He was followed by Tikkana, 1220 to 1300, and the task was completed by Yara Pragada, 1280 to 1350. Palkuriki Somnatha of the 14th century wrote Anubhav Sarmu, and the two biographies Basav Puranamu and Pandit Aradha Charitramu. These were preeminent Saiva literary canons. In the 15th century, Srinath, Vemanna happened to be leading bhakti saints of this area. We will end our discussion on South Indian bhakti here. We may say that the bhakti cult was extremely important in this region during this period. Its cultural and religious contribution had a definite impact on the whole of India in the later centuries. Thank you.